February 1944. Deep beneath the volcanic rock of Rabaul, the air is thick, hot, and unmoving. In an underground command bunker, Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka pauses over his journal. His hand trembles slightly, not from fear of American shells, but from the words he's about to write, words that, if discovered, could end his career. Above him, the ground vibrates as American B-24 bombers pass overhead, not once, not twice, but every day, like clockwork. The men have stopped counting the raids. They call it the milk run. Rabaul was supposed to be untouchable. 100,000 Japanese soldiers, 5 airfields, hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, miles of tunnels carved into stone. The most powerful fortress Japan had ever built in the South Pacific. And yet, no invasion comes. American fleets sail past the horizon, their smoke visible in the distance, heading west toward Japan itself. They do not stop. They do not attack. They do not even acknowledge the garrison, watching helplessly from the shore. Kusaka writes what no one in Tokyo wants to admit. The Americans are not fighting us, he confides. They are strangling us. In that moment, deep inside a fortress that would never be assaulted, the Japanese command begins to understand something terrifying. The war they prepared for is not the war they are being forced to fight. The Japanese war plan in the Pacific was not improvised. It was deliberate, and in its own way, it was beautiful. Imperial planners believed war followed rules, that enemies advanced directly, the territory had to be taken step by step, and that no great power could simply ignore a fortified threat behind its lines. The Pacific, with its vast distances and scattered islands, seemed perfectly suited for a defensive masterpiece. Each island would become a fortress, each garrison an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Airfields would project power far out over the ocean. Coastal guns would deny anchorages. Infantry, dug deep into coral and volcanic rock, would force the enemy into brutal frontal assaults. Every American landing would be paid for in blood. In September 1943, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo formally declared the creation of the Absolute National Defense Zone, a vast perimeter stretching across the Pacific, from the Kuril Islands in the north through the Marianas and Carolines down to New Guinea and Burma. Inside this line, Japan would fight to the death. Outside it, the enemy could roam but never break through. The strategy rested on a single assumption, that the Americans had no choice. Amphibious warfare was slow, it was complex, it required enormous fleets, constant resupply, and perfect coordination between sea, air, and land. Every invasion consumed time, fuel, ships, and men. If the Americans were forced to capture every major base, the cost would eventually become unbearable. Japanese commanders were confident this was where their advantage lay. They believed American industry could be bled white. That morale would crack under mounting casualties. That public opinion would turn against a war measured in islands whose names few Americans could pronounce. Most of all, they believed in spirit. That disciplined soldiers, fighting from prepared positions, could overcome any material disadvantage through endurance and sacrifice. On paper, the plan was flawless. What it did not account for, what no one in Tokyo seriously considered, was the possibility that the Americans would look at this carefully constructed wall of fortresses and decide not to climb it at all. If Japan's strategy was a theory, Rabaul was its proof. Carved into the northeastern tip of New Britain, Rabaul was more than a base. It was the beating heart of Japanese power in the South Pacific, a natural harbor ringed by mountains, protected by reefs and heavy guns. From here, Japan controlled sea lanes, airspace, and operations, stretching from New Guinea to the Solomon Islands. By late 1943, it had been transformed into a fortress without equal. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers crowded the island. 5 major airfields could launch hundreds of aircraft. The harbor bristled with cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. 300 anti-aircraft guns guarded the skies. Beneath the jungle, miles of tunnels connected command posts, hospitals, ammunition depots, and living quarters, all carved directly into volcanic rock. General Hitoshi Imamura, commanding the 8th Area Army, was confident. In letters to Tokyo, he described Rabaul as impregnable. If the Americans came, they would come here, and if they came here, they would suffer. Japanese officers imagined the battle in vivid detail: waves of landing craft burning on the beaches, Marines cut down by artillery, carrier aircraft shredded by flak. Rabaul would be the place where American momentum finally broke. But weeks passed, then months. The Americans bombed Rabaul relentlessly, yet never softened the beaches. They destroyed aircraft on the ground, cratered runways, struck ships in the harbor, and then disappeared. Each raid seemed to promise invasion. Each time, nothing followed. From the hills above the harbor, Japanese lookouts watched American fleets steam past, visible on the horizon, their course set not toward Rabaul, but beyond it, toward islands closer to Japan, toward objectives that made no sense within Japanese doctrine. Inside the tunnels, confusion replaced confidence. If Rabaul was the key to the South Pacific, why was it being ignored? If the Americans were afraid to attack, why were they not retreating? And if this was victory, if holding Rabaul meant success, why did it feel like the war was moving farther away with every passing week? The fortress had been built as a trap. Slowly, Japanese commanders began to realize something unthinkable. The Americans had seen it too and simply walked around it. At first, the Americans' movements were dismissed as cowardice. In June 1943, U.S. forces landed on Woodlark and Kirawina Islands, small, lightly defended outposts east of New Guinea. Japanese intelligence officers at Rabaul were almost relieved. These were not real objectives. These were not fortresses. Surely, they reasoned, the Americans were avoiding serious resistance. Captain Toshio Takahashi, an intelligence officer stationed at Rabaul, wrote confidently that the enemy nibbles at the edges like mice, afraid of the lion. To many Japanese commanders, the landing seemed to confirm everything they already believed. The Americans lacked the will to confront strength head-on. But something about the pattern felt wrong. The Americans did not linger. They did not consolidate for an assault on nearby strongholds. Instead, engineers arrived almost immediately. Runways were carved out of jungle. Fuel dumps appeared. Radar stations rose where nothing had stood before. These islands were not being fortified for defense. They were being transformed into tools. Days later, American aircraft began flying from airfields that had not existed weeks earlier. Then came New Georgia. Here, at last, was the battle Japanese commanders had been waiting for. More than 10,000 Japanese troops defended the island, centered around the vital airfield at Munda Point. Fighting was brutal, exhausting, and costly. Jungle swallowed units whole. Disease killed as efficiently as bullets. By August 1943, the Americans had taken Munda. And then they stopped. They did not pursue the retreating Japanese forces. They did not clear the island. They did not hunt down survivors. Instead, they expanded the airfield, secured what they needed, and moved on. Major Kenji Hatano, who survived the fighting, later reported his confusion to superiors at Rabaul. "The Americans fight differently," he wrote. "They take what they need and leave us the rest. It is as if we do not matter to them." That sentence spread quietly through command circles. If the enemy no longer needed to destroy Japanese forces to advance, what did that mean for the thousands of soldiers waiting inside fortresses like Rabaul? For the first time, confidence gave way to unease. By late 1943, denial was no longer possible. What Japanese commanders were witnessing was not a series of isolated landings, but a pattern, deliberate, methodical, and deeply unsettling. The American offensive, now known as Operation Cartwheel, was never aimed at capturing Japan's strongest bases. It was designed to make them irrelevant. From Rabaul, officers began tracing the American advance on their maps. The picture that emerged was horrifying. Instead of driving straight toward Japanese fortresses, U.S. forces were selecting islands that offered one thing above all else: space to build airfields. Again and again, the same sequence repeated. The Americans landed where resistance was light. Engineers followed immediately. Within weeks, fighters and bombers were operating from freshly poured runways. Japanese strongholds nearby were not attacked. They were surrounded by air power and cut off from the sea. Rabaul, once the center of the Japanese defensive system, was slowly being encircled without a single American soldier setting foot on its beaches. The implications were staggering. If the Americans could neutralize a fortress without invading it, then Japan's entire defensive doctrine collapsed. The carefully prepared killing grounds, the tunnels, the artillery, the thousands of men trained to die defending them, all of it depended on the enemy coming ashore. Now, the enemy simply flew overhead. Admiral Minichi Koga, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, refused to accept the reality unfolding at Rabaul. Determined to restore the initiative, he ordered a massive reinforcement of aircraft to the base. In early November 1943, Japan transferred nearly 200 carrier aircraft, including its last veteran pilots. To defend a fortress, the Americans had already decided not to attack. For Japanese commanders at Rabaul, this was a moment of grim hope. Perhaps this was the turning point. Perhaps the Americans would finally be forced into the decisive battle Japan had prepared for. Instead, it became the moment when the truth could no longer be ignored. The Americans were not avoiding Rabaul because they were afraid of it. They were ignoring it because they no longer needed it to be destroyed. In Tokyo, the situation at Rabaul was becoming intolerable. If the Americans would not come to the fortress, then the fortress would have to strike them first. Admiral Minichi Koga, commander of the combined fleet, believed air power was the answer. If Japan could reassert control of the skies around Rabaul, the Americans would be forced to respond. And once they did, the decisive battle would finally come. In early November 1943, Japan made a desperate decision. Nearly 200 carrier aircraft were stripped from the remaining fleet and sent to Rabaul. Zeros, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and most importantly, their pilots. These were not replacements or trainees. They were veterans, men who had attacked Pearl Harbor, men who had shattered British power in the Indian Ocean, men who had survived Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal. They were irreplaceable. The irony was cruel. Japan committed the last of its elite naval aviators to defend a base the Americans had already chosen not to invade. On November 5th, American carrier aircraft struck Rabaul without warning. Bombs tore through the harbor, heavy cruisers burned, aircraft were destroyed on the ground. 6 days later, the Americans returned, this time with even greater force. The sky over Rabaul filled with enemy planes, moving with a precision and confidence Japanese pilots could no longer match. When the raids ended, more than 100 Japanese aircraft were gone. Dozens of veteran aircrew were dead. The survivors were exhausted, scattered, and shaken. And then, the Americans left. There was no follow-up invasion, no landing force on the horizon, no attempt to capitalize on their success. The enemy had achieved exactly what they wanted, the destruction of Japan's remaining experienced carrier pilots, and simply sailed away. Commander Yasuo Kuwahara, a Zero pilot who survived the attacks, struggled to explain what had happened. "We drove them off," he wrote later, "so why does it feel like we lost? They damaged our ships, shot down our planes, and disappeared. We cannot chase them, we cannot strike back, we can only wait." For the men at Rabaul, the realization was devastating. Japan had sacrificed the core of its naval air power, not in a decisive battle, not defending the homeland, but protecting a fortress that the enemy had never intended to capture. After the air battles faded, the true weapon revealed itself. It was not bombs, it was arithmetic. At Rabaul, Lieutenant Commander Toshiro Omi began keeping meticulous records. His reports did not describe heroism or tactics. They listed tonnage, fuel percentages, ammunition reserves, medical supplies, numbers that told a far more frightening story than any battlefield report. In November 1943, Rabaul still received nearly 30,000 tons of supplies each month. Fuel reserves stood at 60%. Ammunition stocks were considered adequate for half a year of heavy fighting. 1 month later, American submarines were sinking 2 ships for every one that arrived. Deliveries fell sharply. Fuel dropped to 40%. By January 1944, no surface vessels had reached Rabaul in weeks. Submarines brought what they could, but a single boat could carry only a fraction of what the garrison needed. That month, barely 2,000 tons arrived. Fuel reserves fell to 30%. Then came the decision no commander ever wants to make. Japanese high command quietly stopped reinforcing Rabaul with aircraft. Fighters and bombers were no longer sent. Replacement parts were withheld. The fortress was still expected to fight, but it was no longer worth supplying. Without fuel, ships became stationary targets. Without aviation fuel, airfields fell silent. Without medicine, disease spread unchecked through the tunnels and camps. Doctors reported malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery sweeping through units that had never fired a shot. Quinine ran out. Soldiers were ordered to use local substitutes, many of them ineffective. Combat readiness declined month by month, not because of enemy action, but because bodies were failing. Rations were cut. Rice allowances shrank. Protein vanished almost entirely. Men trained for years to fight and die now spent their days calculating how long their food would last. The Americans did not need to assault Rabaul. They had turned supply lines into weapons and time into an accomplice. Every day that passed weakened the fortress further. Every day strengthened the enemy bases rising on islands Japan no longer controlled. The war had become a countdown, and Rabaul was running out of numbers that mattered. As Rabaul slowly suffocated, Japanese commanders began to realize they were not alone. Across the Pacific, the same fate was unfolding on island after island, quietly, relentlessly, without the drama of invasion or defeat. Fortresses that had once been cornerstones of Japan's defense were being left behind, cut off from the war that moved steadily westward without them. On Wake Island, bypassed in late 1943, 4,000 Japanese troops remained at their posts. The island was ringed with coastal guns, anti-aircraft batteries, and underground bunkers. Every man stood ready for an American landing that never came. Weeks passed, then months. Enemy ships sailed past just beyond the range of the guns, close enough to be seen through binoculars, too. Far to engage. Captain Shigematsu Sakibara's reports to Tokyo grew increasingly desperate. "All positions manned and prepared for invasion," he radioed. "Enemy forces passed nearby. No attack. Request instructions." None came. On Woliai Atoll in the Caroline Islands, more than 6,000 Japanese soldiers watched American aircraft operate freely from nearby islands. Major General Katsumi Kitamura recorded the slow collapse of morale in his diary. "They do not consider us worth destroying," he wrote. "We have become military orphans." With no hope of resupply, commanders issued orders that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. Units were directed to clear jungle for gardens. Training schedules were replaced with farming assignments. Soldiers planted sweet potatoes, taro, and corn in soil never meant to sustain an army. At Rabaul, General Imamura ordered that half of all daylight hours be devoted to food production. Commanders were evaluated not on combat readiness, but on agricultural yield. Elite infantry divisions, trained for years in the art of battle, became subsistence farmers. Fishing parties ventured out at night, risking air attack for a handful of fish. Others trapped rats, birds, anything edible. Malnutrition spread. Men grew too weak to carry weapons they would never fire. What made the isolation unbearable was not hunger alone. It was irrelevance. The radio still crackled with messages from Tokyo. Promotions were announced. Orders were issued. The fiction of importance remained, even as reality collapsed around it. The fortress islands had not been defeated in battle. They had been transformed into prisons, manned by soldiers waiting for a war that had already moved on. By mid-1944, the meaning of the island-hopping campaign could no longer be ignored. Japanese commanders who survived the bypass began to understand the brutal logic behind it. They saw what happened to garrisons left behind, slowly, starved, isolated, stripped of relevance. And they understood what that fate represented. It was worse than defeat. When Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi arrived on Iwo Jima in June 1944, he carried that understanding with him. Unlike many of his peers, Kuribayashi had watched the war carefully. He had studied the destruction of Rabaul, Truk, Wake, and dozens of lesser-known islands. He did not believe in miracles. From the moment he set foot on Iwo Jima, Kuribayashi made a decision that shocked his officers. The island could not be held. The Americans would come. They would not bypass Iwo Jima. It lay directly in the path toward Japan itself. And when they came, Kuribayashi knew there would be no relief, no reinforcement, no resupply. The lesson of the bypassed garrisons was unmistakable. There would be no rescue. So Kuribayashi abandoned the old doctrine. He forbade massed banzai charges, calling them wasteful and meaningless. He rejected beach defenses that would be annihilated by naval gunfire. Instead, he ordered the island hollowed out from within. Miles of tunnels were carved into the volcanic rock. Artillery was hidden deep underground, emerging only to fire and vanish again. Positions were designed to survive bombardment, not repel landings. Every decision was made with one goal in mind: endurance. In a letter to his wife, written knowing it would only be delivered after his death, Kuribayashi explained his thinking. "I do not fight to win," he wrote. "That is impossible. I fight to make the Americans pay such a price that they will hesitate before coming to Japan." It was a grim evolution of Japanese strategy, not built on victory but on delay, not on glory but on cost. The island-hopping strategy had forced this transformation. Japan no longer fought to stop the American advance everywhere. It fought only where it could not be ignored, and it fought knowing the end was already decided, hoping only to make that end as painful as possible. Iwo Jima was not a rejection of island-hopping. It was proof that Japan had finally understood it. While Japanese garrisons waited and withered, the Americans were building. They were not building monuments or fortresses. They were building movement. Across the Pacific, entire islands were reshaped in weeks. Seabees, U.S. Navy construction battalions, landed alongside assault troops, sometimes under fire, and began work immediately. Coral was crushed and rolled into runways. Harbors were dredged. Fuel tanks, repair shops, hospitals, and supply depots rose where jungle and sand had stood days before. The Americans did not conquer islands to hold them forever. They used them, then moved on. Floating bases followed the advance. Repair ships fixed damaged vessels at sea. Hospital ships absorbed casualties without slowing operations. Liberty ships arrived in endless columns, unloading men, vehicles, ammunition, and food faster than Japanese submarines could sink them. This was not a war of heroic stands. It was a war of throughput. Every new airfield extended American reach, every repaired runway shortened the distance to Japan, and every bypassed Japanese garrison became another fixed point, a threat that existed only on paper. Submarines completed the circle. By 1944, American boats were sinking more Japanese merchant shipping than bombs ever could. Oil tankers vanished, food shipments disappeared, replacement parts never arrived. The Japanese Navy still had ships, but increasingly it had nothing to fuel them with. The consequences were devastating. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese carrier aviation collapsed in a single afternoon. Pilots were poorly trained, aircraft scarce, fuel limited. The veterans lost at Rabaul, and earlier battles were gone forever. American losses, by contrast, were easily replaced. Pilots trained faster than they could be killed. Planes produced faster than they could be destroyed. Japan had built a strategy around courage and endurance. America built one around systems. Factories replaced battlefields. Shipyards replaced temples of sacrifice. Engineers, logisticians, and planners became the decisive force of the war. The island-hopping campaign was never about taking territory for its own sake. It was about constructing a moving platform of power, one that advanced steadily westward while everything behind it slowly fell silent. By 1945, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The only question that remained was how much suffering would occur before the machinery finally reached Japan itself. When the war finally ended in August 1945, silence fell across hundreds of islands scattered through the Pacific. On many of them, nothing changed. More than 300,000 Japanese soldiers were still alive on bypassed garrisons, men who had never been defeated in battle, never seen an American soldier, never fired the shots they had spent years preparing to fire. Some were emaciated, many were sick, all were isolated. On islands like Wake, Truk, Rabaul, and Wolai, the news of surrender arrived slowly, carried by scratchy radio transmissions or leaflets dropped from aircraft. For some, the messages were dismissed as enemy deception. Others believed the emperor's voice must be a trick. A war that had never reached them could not simply end. Months passed before order returned. American ships eventually appeared, not with invasion forces, but with medical teams and supplies. Japanese officers emerged from tunnels they had lived in for years. Weapons were stacked neatly. Flags were lowered without ceremony. There were no victory parades on these islands, no final charges, no last stands. Only men stepping into the sunlight, thinner and older than when the war began, realizing they had been fighting time itself, and that time had moved on without them. The island-hopping strategy did more than defeat Japan's defenses. It dissolved them. It turned fortresses into spectators, armies into burdens, resistance into waiting. Japan had prepared for a war of decisive battles. America fought a war of distance, production, and patience. And in the end, the most powerful weapon of all was not firepower, but the ability to choose where the war would and would not be fought. If this story is worth remembering, share your thoughts below.